All right, I appear to be live, which is always very exciting. I always take the first minute or so of time that I'm live to just make sure that everything is working and that I can be heard, and it looks like I can. Excellent. If you cannot hear me, please let me know. I will go ahead and type that up just in case. If you can't hear me, just say so. If you can't hear me, let me know. There. So today's video is going to be a curious one, and not video live stream. We are going to be talking about mythology from Pathfinder. And for those of you who have no idea what Pathfinder is one of the competitors of Wizards of the Coast's Dungeons and Dragons. So it is a tabletop role-playing game. It's a very fun tabletop role-playing game, and just like there are metric tons of YouTubers who create content that talk about D&D, there are a handful of YouTubers who talk about Pathfinder. The company that owns Pathfinder is called Paizo, and if you ask me, Pathfinder is infinitely more entertaining and interesting than D&D is, but D&D is just the most popular tabletop role-playing game / like fantasy role-playing game that you can play with your friends. So it is the one that gets the most fame. All right, awesome. I'm just checking comments to see what's going on. So if you see me looking to the side, that's what I am doing. But in today's video, I wanted to talk about the beginning of everything as it exists in Pathfinder. Because unlike some editions of D&D, there is a sort of unified myth of the beginning that exists in Pathfinder that is readily accessible, but not that many players are familiar with it. I'm going to be making videos that talk about Pathfinder lore in the future. And when I say videos, I do mean actual videos. I don't mean what I'm doing right now, which is just live streams, but I fell sick at the end of last week and I was out of commission for a few days. So even though I have a handful of scripts ready that talk about the lore of Pathfinder in a sort of in-universe voice, I actually haven't sat down and started recording those videos. And I wanted to go ahead and get in front of a camera and to talk about what I've found. So in order to go and talk about everything in a way that makes sense, I wanted us to talk about the beginning's beginning and then the end's end. Because in Pathfinder, as I previously mentioned, there is a unified myth of the beginning. There is an in-canon resource called the Concordance of Rivals, which is one of 3 tomes that have been penned by an angel named Tabris, who is sometimes known as the Chronicler, that talks about the beginning of all of existence, or at least talks about the beginning of this iteration of existence, because Pathfinder's universe, or rather their multiverse, is set in a setting where there have been multiple iterations of reality. There has been at least one iteration of reality that existed before, and there have been multiple resources in game that have hinted that there have been more than one actual sort of in-setting multiverse that existed before the current one. Also, hey everyone, I'm excited that so many people are stopping by. You're getting to see me with long hair and a beard, and yes, there is more beard than hair, but I mean, it's me, so what can you expect? I'm so excited that so many people are stopping by. It looks like I have between 4 to 7 people right now, which is wild to me because I decided to do this really off the cuff. But in order to get everything going, I guess I should talk about the beginning's beginning. In order to set the scene, I want you to picture nothing. I want you to close your eyes, and I want you to just picture a blank slate in front of you. There's no color, there's no physical objects off in the distance, there's nothing underneath you, there's nothing on top of you. You are the only thing in existence. Because when this particular set of realities came into existence, the very first being that existed, that was all she could see. The very first being that ever existed in this particular iteration of reality was named Pharasma. And Pharasma is known now as the goddess of fate. In some cases, I've seen her have nicknames like the Silver Lady, which is not a nickname that's unique to her, so it's not a very good one. But she is the goddess of birth, death, fate, and prophecy. And more than that, she is a survivor from the previous iteration of reality. If you go to the very first pages of the Concordance of Rivals, which is both an in-game tome that exists that players can find and can read, including copies of it. It's not a unique book that there's like only one of or anything. But it's also a resource for players and for game masters, because Pathfinder, they're not like Dungeons & Dragons, which has that really obnoxious whole dungeon master thing. I'm personally not a fan of that term. I think it's really annoying. But the very first page of the Concordance of Rivals states, the creation of the universe. Everything begins, everything ends. And then there is a little paragraph that talks about the old existence that was brought to ruin for unknown causes. There are no current existing resources that ever talk in detail about the old reality that once was, which is really unfortunate. There are things that talk about it enough that you can get some ideas of what it was like. And yes, I know people are going to try to derail me, but I have a plan to stay relatively focused. This is a live stream, so it's fine for me to get a little bit off topic and for me to look at comments and stuff. And also, I just really like this sort of like conversational format. I think it's really fun. You can also hear live noise interruptions from the background. I don't know how clearly you could hear that, but I could very clearly hear just like a distant pop from what was probably my kitchen. But yeah, so once the very first paragraph of the Concordance of Rivals has been finished, it states, not all was lost. The wreckage of reality had been reduced to quintessential dust that floated aimlessly, forming a sea of creative potential and shapeless uncertainty. But not all of existence was gone, because there was one survivor and one relic from the old universe, or from the old multiverse. Something that I personally find really annoying is that like in-game and also like existing resources for Pathfinder are really inconsistent about whether or not the setting is a universe or a multiverse. So I'm just going to say that regardless of whichever one I am using at the time, just know that I'm talking about the same thing. I know they're not the same thing. I'm not the only person who constantly does this. So Callan is a friend of Tria, Zal, and a whole bunch of other people, and mine, who does D&D with us. Callan is actually in the Discord server. She's a polytheist who also lives in the same town as me. She and I have actually known each other since before I was an atheist, which is like wild to me. She plays D&D with us sometimes, but she is not going to be playing D&D in the game that we are doing. So in the game that you, me, possibly Jessica, Capri, and a bunch of other people are going to be in, Callan will not be in that one, because Callan is not a beginner, and because Callan is very chaotic, and I don't know how well I'd be able to handle that in a setting where everyone else is beginners. So yeah. Also, for those of you who don't know, I am doing a D&D campaign. Work has been slow on it, but I am inching towards getting it ready so that we can have our first live stream. It's just for D&D babies and for me, someone who's been playing D&D for over half of my life. But I do plan to do more than one campaign. And in other campaigns, I will be having more people who are not beginners. So, yeah. But, so Pharasma is floating around in the sea of quintessential dust. She is the only being in existence. Or so she would like to think, but she knows better than to think that she's the only creature out there. It's true that she is the only survivor from the last iteration of reality, but she is not alone. We're going to get into that in just a second. but she is riding atop a seal, which has been described in a resource that does not really exist like in universe, called the I'm gonna look it up right now, but it's called the Windsong Testaments, the Three Fears of Pharasma, and it is a blog post from Paizo that talks about like the very beginning of reality in greater detail than the concordance of Rivals does. And it's just a little short story that's told kind of from Pharasma's point of view, but mostly around Pharasma, that talks about like the very beginning of reality. And in this resource, it says that on the seal is writ, reality is born, reality must die, so somewhere in between must dwell both you and I. And it's said to be written in a way that anyone can understand it, regardless of their ability to understand language or regardless of their like intelligence, which is really interesting. If you are a D&D nerd, then you might know that in D&D there's a language called Super Neil, which is the language of the gods. And it's a language that only higher beings can speak, at least like in full sentences, and that anyone can understand. It's the thing that gives gods the ability to speak to anyone and anything, which is something that I took from D&D and made into an aspect of a story that I'm writing, which is how I have so many internet friends. People like the story that I'm writing, and so sometimes they see me doing other things, and they're like, if that person's writing that story, maybe I should go check out the other stuff that they're doing. But Pharasma was writing atop her seal, which was an artifact from presumably her homeworld. And it's actually very interesting because Pharasma's nature and the sort of existence that she existed within in the old iteration of reality is also never really expanded upon. It's unclear she was a deity in the old existence, or if she became a deity upon witnessing the end of her home reality. And also, it's not super clear if that's the first reality that she's ever witnessed, but it's very strongly stated that that is her native reality. So she wants to fix the mistakes. And there were some mistakes that were happening in that old universe that we're going to get into in just a second. But as she floated upon her seal, she thought to herself, and she pondered upon the mistakes that had been made in the old iteration of reality. While she was thinking about this, she wasn't really doing a whole lot, and the existence that she was in now was sort of in stasis. Things were sort of happening around her, but nothing really important was happening. Mostly things were existing and vibing, and that was the nature of reality for probably a period that could be measured in the tens of thousands of years, because gods experience time very differently than mortals do. Even in things like D&D and Pathfinder, that's part of the reason why it is that some divine realms experience the flow of time differently. This isn't quite as big a deal in Pathfinder as it is in D&D, but it exists to an extent in both. So after a while, she pondered on the mistakes that happened in her old existence, and she finally decided that she needed to act. So what she decided to do was she decided to protect this reality from those who remain, which is the name of creatures that we identify as being Lovecraftian deities. So this is creatures like Shub-Niggurath, Cthulhu, Abathoth, Azathoth, the nuclear idiots, which was like the most powerful of the outer gods. So these beings existed beyond the reach of the multiverse, which means that even though they had seen all of the old iteration of reality, they were unaffected when it came to an end. They stayed beyond the reach of the multiverse that once was. So they were able to watch as the multiverse that now was being created. And that's something that I find super fascinating. It's more detail is dove into in the Windsong Testaments, including the including like a super unpleasant little tidbit that states that every iteration of reality, which also basically confirms that there's more than 2 iterations of reality in Pathfinder. There have been at least 3 or 4. Every iteration of reality not only needs someone from the reality that came before it, but they also need the representative of the dimension of time, which is a creature known as Yog-Sothoth. And this is a creature. Oh, Jessica thought that this was about John. No, this is about Pathfinder, which is not Shy's setting, which is where John exists. That's funny. But Yog-Sothoth is the embodiment of the dimension of time. And every iteration of reality that needs to exist, every iteration of reality that's ever been and ever will be, will take one person from the old reality and Yog-Sothoth, and it will pair them up, and together they'll be the dual anchors that allow reality to exist. Which means that Pharasma is the one being in all of Pathfinder that is well and truly unkillable. Well, her and Yog-Sothoth. And if someone wanted to depict the end of times, which we will get to in this video, they could either try to take her out and I guess succeed somehow, or they could take out Yog-Sothoth, which is also probably equally impossible. Pathfinder is very silly, and there are things that talk about the end of all times. Listen, I've been brought off topic several times now. I always naturally rear myself back in because this is something that I like doing. But in order to protect this iteration of reality from those who remain, from the Lovecraftian outer gods, what Pharasma did was she did 2 things at once. She created a long rod, and that she held it in one hand. This rod would later be known as Pharasma's Spire, and it's where she vibes when she is not doing other stuff. We're going to get to that in a second, too. And with the other hand, she stirred the quintessential dust that made up this iteration of reality. So she set it about, and it began to flow like it was a giant whirlpool. There are different layers and different things that go into this quintessential dust. I'm not going into this in a like excruciating detail because it's easier for me to keep this relatively simple. In my video where I talk about this like at super length, I actually will talk about this in significant detail. But basically what she was trying to do is she was trying to create basically a bunch of giant cotton candy. That's the easiest way to think about this. She was in the middle of a giant, yes, Adam, dust has layers. She was trying to create just a bunch of giant cotton candy. And the little like stick that she would give you so that you could eat the cotton candy was the long rod that she created. That little long rod was in the middle of all of this, I guess you could call it cosmic madness. It was in all of this silliness that was going on right now. The whole purpose of spinning all of the quintessential dust was that the current of the dust would make it harder for those that remain to get to the center of existence and devour everything that existed inside of the center of existence. It would keep them from devouring her, and it would keep them from devouring the seal. What the seal does is annoyingly like never super described. I wish that it was like made more specific in game, but I think it's just because the people who wrote this myth were like, hey, we want to explain everything with enough detail that like there's one unified theory of everything, but we want to give the players and especially the game masters enough room to just really go buck wild if they wanted to do it. No, not seals the animal. Seal, like, God, it's really it's really annoying to describe. Think of it as a giant gravestone because it's actually how it's described in universe in the Windsong Testaments. There's a section that describes the seal in excruciating detail. but also doesn't say what it does. And it's like, this is just a giant gravestone that anyone can read. So if you ever see it, that's cool. Listen, this isn't the time to be quoting Star Wars. So once Pharasma had done all of this, Pharasma threw the seal in the middle of the sea of quintessential dust. And once it was there, she began to swindle it in layers of quintessential dust, and she began to try and do her best to make it super safe. I am describing all of this to the best of my abilities, so this isn't going to be 100% accurate. Once you decide to read the Concordance of Rivals, there's some minor differences that you'll probably have upon reading this. But I do recommend that you check it out. The Concordance of Rivals is a really cool book, and I like it a lot. But once everything was set in motion, and once the seal was placed, Pharasma began to vibe. That was the point where, like, the most direct things that she had done up until that point were, like, what she felt she super needed to do. So she decided to go and watch the quintessential currents that she had set in motion. And it was while she was doing this that we actually began, as readers, to begin to understand what the differences are between this iteration of reality and the old iteration of reality. The very next block of text describes her staring into the cold space of just sort of empty existence. And she began to think about all of the different sorts of life that existed in her native reality. She began to think about how it was that they came to be, and it's hinted that they were created directly by the gods, which is very interesting because in Pathfinder, there are a few instances of gods directly creating life forms, but those are actually extremely rare. This is not like D&D, where like every race has like a patron deity. For instance, in D&D, elves and dwarves have very explicit patron deities, but in Pathfinder, only dwarves have like a super well-known patron creator deity, and the main elven goddess is Calixtra, who is the goddess of revenge and lust, and also bees for some reason. She really likes bees and wasps, and it's the oddest thing. But she is not the creator of elven kind. She is a goddess who the elves picked up and just really liked, which I think is really cool. But what she decided to do is she decided not to directly interfere and create life directly. She decided that once everything had been set in motion, which it had already been, she would let things play out however they were going to play out naturally, which is one of the big differences and explains why it is that there aren't that many instances of gods super creating races in Pathfinder. I swear, if you read like books in D&D, and especially like in deity lore in D&D, every god creates every race. It's really annoying. But at the very least, it gives you like super clear origins for every single race. In Pathfinder, most species do not have super clear origins. I'm going to go on a tangent for 2 seconds, and I'll talk about one of the extremely few exceptions to this. Drow have super clear origins. And the origins of Drow is that on Galarian, which is the world where most Pathfinder adventures are probably going to take place, it's like the default assumed setting. I just got a text message and it's spam. There is a deity named Rovagug, who is also known as the Destroyer, who is stuck at the center of the planet because an alliance of gods came together and they just fucked his whole shit up. He had been eating entire planets. He was what's known as a Qiploth Lord, and the Qiploths were some of the first beings that ever came into existence. They were the first inhabitants of the Abyss. They were beings of both chaos and evil. They were basically the granddaddies of demons, and the most powerful Qiploths were Qiploth Lords. Also, Alhana, Drow is like the common D&D term for dark elves. and yeah. So they're dark elves. They're edgy dark elves. And what basically ended up happening is that Rovagug's whole shit got fucked up, and he got stuck at the center of the planet. He was stuck in a demiplane. It has a fancy name. I don't feel like looking it up right now. I will do a video on Rovagug where I talk about the Alliance of Gods that fucked his whole shit up. It was really funny. But because of his influence, if you were underneath the planet's surface, if you were like underground in Galarian, you were basically potentially susceptible to his influence. Which is the god that the dwarves and that's Torug. Torug is one of the few deities who like super explicitly created his race. Just like in D&D, I can't remember like the exact details of the myth, but with Torug, if I remember correctly, he made them from like statues and stuff, and he like gave them life. So basically dwarves, like the original dwarves, are super fancy golems, which is really similar to their origin in like World of Warcraft, which is also super neat, but that's a tangent. And I'm not going to get into that right now. There was an event called Earthfall, which was when a bunch of alien octopus overlords who were vibing in Galarian's oceans brought a whole bunch of meteorites onto the surface of Galarian in order to fuck up the first human empire that they had helped create, but then the humans like rebelled against them. And the elves saw the shit coming, so some elves decided to go to their home world, which is another world. The edgy dwarves, that is God, I can't remember his name off the top of my head. I will look it up and I will post it in a comment when the video is done. But he's a psychic asshole. I think his name's Droskar. I'll actually type it up because I do remember it. Droskar. Yeah, that's the god the edgy dwarves worship. But what ended up happening with the Dro is that they were elves who went into the underground because they didn't know that that was where Rovagug was vibing, or was rather stuck vibing. He wasn't there happily. And once they came in and they sort of like took up shelter while meteorites fucking annihilated the planet, there's a whole bunch of stuff that happens. That's an event called Earthfall that I'm not going to get into here. But while that was happening, they went underground and they started fighting some of the creatures who were underground. This includes dwarves, Daragar, and orcs. Orcs and dwarves fucking hate each other in Pathfinder. That's a really neat story too. Not going to get into that. But they started fighting their way down so that way they could find a place that would be safe. They ended up taking like their home. The edgy dwarf. No, that's not a dwarf. That's a moon guy. Unless they're just really making it really fast and loose. But Grodius is really interesting. We're going to talk about Grodius probably at the end of this live stream. This live stream might end up being a little bit more than an hour. That's fine. I really like this topic. So once the elves were underground, and once they had fought their way sufficiently underground that they felt safe, they started hearing whispers from Rovagug. Rovagug was super pissed, and he was corrupting their minds, and he ended up making them far more bloodthirsty than they needed to be. And he also ended up turning their minds towards the worship of demons, which is actually really interesting because Qiploths and demons fucking hate each other. They cannot like each other. They are like almost intrinsically bound to try and hate each other. But Grodius was mostly just trying to dick around with them. It's also kind of unclear if this was actually like a conscious act on Rovagug's part. It's entirely possible that they were just deep enough down and mystically attuned enough that they were able to pick up the psychic waves that were coming from the center of the planet, and that just ended up corrupting them and making them chaotic evil. So when they turned chaotic evil, they were just like, oh yeah, demons exist. We'll worship demons. And that is the whole thing with Dro and that's the whole thing with Dro and Pathfinder. That's like one of their big two characteristics. They don't have a singular god or goddess that they worship like they do in D&D in the form of Loth, even though Loth has like a whole pantheon of assholes who are just like stuck with her and who are worshipped by the Dro. It's not just her. But they actually have thank you, Capri. Oh yeah, demons are here. They're also like another really important thing about Drow and Pathfinder that separates them from Drow in D&D and other like forms of media that depict elves and dark elves is that elves are actually capable of spontaneously becoming dark elves, which is rad as fuck. That very famously happens in the background of Second Darkness, which is an adventure path, which means that it's a whole campaign of adventures that people who want to play Pathfinder can go and play. But there is an elf in the elven nation that I cannot pronounce who is like worried about the threat that dark elves pose, and she wants to do something about that. And like fellow people who are also part of a real extremist faction that exists inside of elven society and Pathfinder hear her, and they're like, look, we're all extremists, but what you're suggesting is like xenocide. You're suggesting that we do something that could wipe out at least one entire species, and we're not cool with that. And she looks at them and she's like, well, you know what? I'm cool with that. And if I can't eliminate them, I guess I'll just eliminate you. She murders someone, she gets poofed into a dark elf, and then she flees. And she's the central antagonist. It's an extremely cool campaign that I would like to run, but it's old school Pathfinder. The elven nation of that thing from SpongeBob. It's like Kuyinim, but I can't pronounce it or spell it off the top of my head. So yeah, Drow and Pathfinder worship demons, and if you're a regular elf and you do something of like incredible evil, you can become a dark elf. It's also worth noting, like it can't be something like regular evil. You need to do some like advanced evil bullshit in order to trigger the like I guess devolution into a dark elf. In game they never like explain the mechanics behind it, but basically they're just like, look, if you're an elf and you're not only a regular baddie but like an advanced baddie, then you can become a dark elf. So keep that in mind. But yeah, going back to the beginning of the beginning, once Pharasma was vibing and she was just living her life being free and probably sexy, I guess, she started looking at everything that existed, and she just started watching stuff because she didn't advanced evil hell versus super hell. Yeah, basically. She started like watching all of existence, and she like was perfectly content doing it. It's not super clear what she was actually doing during this time, but basically she was just like watching stuff. And one of the things that would happen is that sometimes quintessential storms would happen where I guess it's just like a hurricane of quintessential dust that just goes around and just fucks shit up around it. Probably sexy, I guess. I love how iconic some of my quotes are, especially given that I'm Ace. But one of these storms decided that being a storm was not enough. So we're gonna talk a little bit about what this particular asshole's specific identity is, because this is a creature that exists that has like a name, and I'm pretty sure it does have stats written down. But there was a storm that decided that being a storm wasn't cool enough, and after it became big enough, it started to like remember shit from the old iteration of reality, and it grew hands. It grew limbs, and it just sort of ripped itself free of the current that was like that was vibing in, and it started roaming around all of existence. Pharasma noticed this, and she started watching it because she was really confused. She's just like, what in the fuck is that, I guess, living storm that exists? I'm reading the comments, so please be nice, y'all. Remember that I'm always here. I guess always watching, I guess. And as she watched the storm started to like rip reality apart. It wasn't doing it like intentionally, but like everywhere that it went, that it left, things started to disintegrate and just started to vanish. And that was really bad, because that means that if this storm was left alone long enough, then obviously everything would be wiped away. So Pharasma decided to confront it. She went over to it and she called its name and she asked it what kind of creature it was, what was its name. We just like each other aggressively. I'm glad that you all like each other aggressively. I am sometimes concerned. And after this, the storm just started looking at her, and the eye of the hurricane, the so-called like calm of the storm, started to, I guess, started to make images. This is like the weirdest thing in the world to try and describe, but basically the part of a storm, the part of a hurricane where everything is calm, started to show different images because it wanted to try and communicate back to Pharasma. It didn't want to say anything, and only sometimes. Oh, wait, now the comments are kind of confusing, but I'm glad you all are being nice to each other. That's the only thing that matters, or at least being acceptingly mean. If you're not going to be nice, just don't be overly mean, just don't push boundaries. That's what matters. And in the image of the eye of this cosmic hurricane, different scenes started to play out. Scenes almost from the old iteration of reality. So things like an orderly cosmos, which is one of the things that the old iteration of reality was known for being. And then different things started to happen. Things that Pharasma had never seen before appeared in its central eye image TV screen. Once again, this is a really weird thing to describe, y'all. I hope you're being like a little bit charitable with me here, because even if you read this, even if I read it verbatim, it's kind of weird. I actually will read this verbatim just so that you can see what it is that I'm describing. Plants the survivor had never seen multiplied and filled alien landscapes. Stars burned, grew, and exploded, releasing a wealth of material from which new planets would arise. The passage of days gave ways to night in equal measure. All things existed in balance. And Pharasma saw this, and she was very confused and also concerned, because this was not quite a reflection of the reality that she was from, but it was close enough that she knew that at some point this iteration of reality would end if she didn't act somehow. So she asked the storm how it is that she could prevent this from happening. She told it about the destruction of the old reality, presumably, and she asked how they could work together to ensure that that wouldn't happen. And once again, the vortex responded in a way. It didn't quite respond, but the images changed. What it ended up showing was it showed animals growing so populous that disease could destroy them. It showed clockwork that was so perfectly tuned that if even a single bit of it fucked up, then the whole thing was destroyed. With its eyes played out scenes of such depravity that the actors rebelled at their own vileness, followed by narratives of utter shapelessness that begat order merely by chance. The survivor could discern regulation, yet it arose from and in opposition to anarchy. Like spun thread, each opposing concept would twist together to create a united whole, remaining bound together, even as each element attempted to unwind against each other. And basically what this is saying is that the disparate fractions that would exist, wait a minute, I said fractions. The disparate factions that would come to exist would oppose each other, but in their opposition, they would inadvertently create something that they couldn't destroy. By fighting one another and by being opposed to each other, they would create a balance that would be really difficult for reality itself to fight against. Also, if you're here and you're vibing and you're having a fun time, I hope you consider liking the video. Blah, blah, blah. I'm not gonna go into that whole thing. But basically, as long as these factions fought each other and as long as none of them got too powerful, a balance would be created that would be really difficult to unwind. Pharasma saw this, and she was more or less content with it because she knew that even though people would fight each other and they would like not be able to work together and shit, she saw that this multiverse would exist for a while, and she was content with that. So what she ended up doing was she ended up tasking the vibing storm with, I guess, sort of being a shepherd of reality, being like one of the guardians that keeps reality together and that works to make sure that everything is balanced enough. And the storm didn't say anything because the storm doesn't speak, and the storm sort of fucked off after that. But it seemed to accept its role because after this, miniature storms that were just like it appeared where it was and began to fix things. So the stuff that the storm had been threatening to tear apart was actually repaired by baby storms, which is super interesting. So now this is basically the entire myth. But the last part of the myth states that once the storm had fucked off and gone off somewhere, I'm sorry if that's a really funny way to describe it. The storm had fucked off. Once the storm was gone and Pharasma was once again by herself, she looked back to the seal and she gained a sort of new ability. She saw new sparks of life. And in those sparks of life, she began to be able to read the countless possibilities that awaited each and every single little spark. So you think that that's okay. The fuckery of the storm. But yeah, once the storm had fucked off, she was looking back at the seal. There were sparks of life. And she was able to see what those sparks of life would ultimately form. And she began to see all of the little lives that those first lives would create and would influence. And at first she was kind of happy, but then she began to read more and more threads. She began to see more and more possibilities. And she noticed that eventually the possibilities start to narrow and they start to decrease in number. The reason they start to decrease in number is that, once again, this reality is doomed to fail. This reality is doomed to implode and be wiped away at some point in time. And the final passage of the myth, this isn't the entire like resource, by the way. This is just the very beginning of it. But the final passage reads that even eternity was finite. And as the survivor had guided this reality's beginning, so too would she witness its end. It's really there's some like really annoying stuff that this version of the myth does. It refers to Pharasma as the survivor in like throughout the entire thing. It also doesn't name the big storm of fuckery that existed with Pharasma for a few minutes and then fucked off somewhere. We know, like, if you've read enough Pathfinder resources, you can glean that that is a creature named Monad, who is the lord of creatures that are known as Aeons. And I'm going to spell out the name because, God, I can't pronounce that word. Aeon. There. So if you see that in a second, that's what that is. But the creature, the storm that fucked off was Monad, which is the lord of all Aeons. And Monad is they're effectively a giant storm of power that is interested in balance and maintaining existence, and it's really fucking weird. But they lord over Aeons, and Aeons are super powerful outsiders that do a bunch of things related to, I guess, cosmic upkeep. They do stuff that make sure that the universe continues to exist. And you can find them in a handful of adventure paths. You can find them in some places. They're not super common on Galarian because they're mostly in the other planes. I'm pretty as Alhana says, I'm pretty sure that that's how that's supposed to be pronounced. I've seen other people pronounce it differently. It's a word that you will be familiar with if you read a bunch of Lovecraft. I've read a bunch of Lovecraft because I'm that kind of an asshole. But yeah, so that is the beginning of everything. I'm going to take a second to talk about Tabari because Tabari is pretty cool. Tabari is the angel who created the Concordance of Rivals, the Chronicles of Righteousness, and the Book of the Damned. Not in that order. The actual order that Tabari created them is Chronicles of Righteousness, Concordance of Rivals, and the Book of the Damned. And Tabari is an angel from, I think, an angel from heaven who was tasked with chronicling all of the universe. And what that basically means is that this unlucky asshole was stuck going around the different planes of existence and talking to a bunch of different people, and unfortunately went insane and was banished from heaven, which really sucks. The reason Tabari was banished from heaven was because Tabari wrote the Book of the Damned. And the Book of the Damned is both an in-game resource and also a book that like players and game masters can read, so that way they can like learn more about the lower planes. I'm going to talk about the planes of existence in just a second, but basically this angel was given an impossible mission, and then heaven decided that they didn't like the fact that this angel tried to fulfill its mission, and so they told the angel to fuck off, which really sucks. The angel gets killed at some point and is venerated by a group of immortal sages and is found, I think that they're found in Galarian at some point, like their mummified corpse is found. And the three books that they wrote, Chronicles of Righteousness, chronicle the upper planes, which is where good aligned souls go when they die. The Concordance of Rivals mostly talks about the Monitors, which is a faction of super powerful creatures that is tasked with like upholding reality and making sure that the universe doesn't explode or whatever. And then the Book of the Damned is a book about the lower planes, which is where evil souls go. So a mortal begins their life in the positive energy plane as a soul. That's where all souls are created. Souls are then sent to the mortal plane, which is one of the planes in the inner sphere of existence. They live a life as a mortal, and then they die. And when they die, a bunch of different things can happen, but the most common thing that happens is that they begin a journey to the River of Souls and then to Pharasma's Spire, which is where Pharasma's role as a goddess of death begins. Pharasma is the great judge who judges all souls, and she is the final arbiter of what happens to you when you die. If you lived a life of goodness or you worshipped a good aligned deity, you go to one of the upper planes, which is heaven, nirvana, and some other place that I can't remember. That's where people who did their best and would like to just vibe go. That's also where angels, celestials, and some other extraplanar peeps are from. And if you lived a neutral life, you go to one of the neutral planes. Not going to go into those ones. They're not super important and they're kind of boring. But Pharasma's Spire is one of the neutral planes. It's located in a place called the Boneyard, which is also where all atheistic souls vibe. And it's also where Pharasma keeps some specific atheists so she can feed them to Grotius. Grotius is someone that Zal mentioned earlier. We're going to talk about him in a second. And if you were a bad person, then you were sent to one of the lower planes. The lower planes are Abaddon, the Nine Hells, and then the Abyss. And those places are really neat, and we're going to talk about them at a later date. But that's where daemons, demons, and devils are from. And also some other assholes, but they're not ultra important. I will take this time just to mention the origin of demons in Pathfinder. It's really different from the origin of demons in D&D, which is really weird. Qiploths were the first assholes that existed. In the Abyss, they were chaotic evil beings that did not need. There is a doggo in the background. It's my roommate's doggo. He's a very nice doggo. He's a pit bull who likes to jump on people. I really like him. He's very friendly. Also, hey, the Maverick. I hope you're having a nice time. You are not a name I recognize, so I hope that you're here and that you decide to stick around. We cannot see the doggo. There might be a day in the future where we decide to see the doggo, but not right now. The doggo's name is Rhino. He's doing his best, and I like him a lot. He does like food, though, just like most dogs, so he will follow food a whole lot. But the basic origin of demons in Pathfinder is very curious because Qliphotps were the first creatures in the Abyss, and when mortal souls started to come to the Abyss after mortals began to die, they were turned into petitioners, and in the Abyss, the sort of petitioner that you become is a larva. And if you are a larva, that means that you can become a... Also, hey, if you're interested by the title, I hope you're a Pathfinder person. I absolutely love Pathfinder. I am going to be doing Pathfinder lore videos as opposed to live streams. I've just been sick for a little bit, and I wanted to do a live stream today, so I decided to talk about Pathfinder just because I like it so much. That's not my usual content, but I really like it. I'm a nerd. That's my kind of thing. But yeah, I will show that message. And Abyssal larvae can become demons. Abyssal larvae didn't become demons innately, but they started to just sort of infest the Abyss, and the Qliphotps didn't like them, but they started to fuck around with some of them, and some of the Abyssal larvae ended up going to other places like Abaddon, which is where Daemons vibed. We're going to talk about daemons in their own video. They're far too important to talk about in like the beginning because I don't want to do like a super strict timeline right now in a live stream. But basically, there were some super powerful daemons that lorded over other daemons. And I know their names are really like demons. I dislike it too, but yeah. Let me see what that says. At least, yeah, it is really meta. It's weirdly meta, and it's also like one of the newer features of Pathfinder. It was one of the later additions to like the cosmic Pathfinder lore, which is really interesting because the Concordance of Rivals is one of the later books that was added to first edition. For those of you who've never played Pathfinder, there are 2 editions now. Second edition is extremely new. It's only been around for like a year. So yeah, it's not like D&D where there are 5 editions and some editions lasted super long, like 3 and 3.5, and then some editions were super short, like 4, which I think was only like 4 or 5 years long. But yeah, so daemons fucked around with larvae, and then they created demons, and demons were really disliked by Qliphotps because they were able to reproduce super easily, and they started to infest the like easier to reach layers of the Abyss, and they started fighting against the Qliphotps because they were also evil. Oh my goodness, things in the Abyss are evil, and they dislike each other, and they all want all the resources. So because of that, there was this big war in the Abyss. What ended up happening with the Qliphotps was really interesting. They started losing the war like really badly because demons were capable of growth like super fast, and demons were capable of hearing the voices of mortals. They were capable of hearing mortal prayers and answering them, which led to the rise of the first demon lords. And the first demon lords were very, very powerful. They also died really fast. There are not that many demon lords that have been around since like the beginning of demonkind. There's a handful, but most of them got super killed in the wars with the Qliphotps. There's also not that many Qliphotps lords in Pathfinder. There's a handful, and almost all of them have stat blocks, which is super interesting. Pathfinder does not like giving divine and divine level beings stat blocks. They normally like to assume that those sorts of creatures are too powerful to be fucked around with by PCs, but in some cases they do give them stat blocks, with the Qiploth Lords being like the only set where like every named Qiploth Lord has a stat block you can find. So if you want to kill all of them, you can without having to make up the stat blocks. Very nice feature. So now we're gonna go back to oh yeah, that's right, Alhana. There's more than 5 editions. There's like advanced, there's like 2nd edition advanced, there's regular 2nd edition, there's 3.5, and then there's like a whole bunch of other ones. It's wild. But now we're gonna talk about the end of time. This is going to be much shorter, so it's not going to take it's not going to take quite as long as the rest of this has. This video will probably only be like another 20 minutes. I'm not going to define quintessence. I'm pretty sure that's how you pronounce that word, because in Pathfinder it's not given a super clear definition. It's basically just the cosmic dust that like underlines all of reality. It's the most basic thing that people are made of. I don't know how to really describe that, but that's how it seems to be described in Pathfinder. But basically, at the end of time, the first thing that's going to happen is Rovagug, the giant demon Qiploth thing we mentioned a couple of times now, is going to bust free of its prison. And when it does, yikes, a lot of bad shit's gonna happen. First of all, Galarian is going to probably be immediately destroyed. Rovagug does have devoted worshippers who, there's 2 sorts of Rovagugites, I guess you could call them. There's some that are foolish and have been tricked either by other Rovagug people or by like their own, I guess, thoughts on the nature of reality. And they think that once Rovagug is free, Rovagug will remake reality. That is not what Rovagug wants to do. Rovagug just wants to eat everything. Rovagug just wants everything to fuck off and die. It will not try to remake reality. It will be the end of reality. So when it breaks free, it's just going to go on a giant rampage, and it's going to go after Sarenrae, who is probably the most famous of all of the Pathfinder deities, because Sarenrae is a deity who is actually also in Critical Role. If you have heard a little bit of Critical Role, especially the beginning, you might remember Pike. Pike was originally a cleric of Sarenrae, because Critical Role was originally a Pathfinder game. And they ended up making Sarenrae into a different deity, because they ended up switching from Pathfinder to 5th edition D&D at some point early on. And I've actually never seen the first season of Critical Role. I only know this just because I love Pathfinder and I know Pathfinder history like pretty well. But they ended up making Sarenrae into the deity, into the Wildmont deity known as Ray. And Ray is a deity that exists in Wildmont resources that can be worshipped. She's more or less the same as she is in Pathfinder. She is a goddess of like of flame, righteous justice, and like forgiveness, which is her whole thing in Pathfinder as well. And in Pathfinder, what she ended up doing was she was one of the members of the Great Alliance that fucked up all of Rovagug's shit back when Rovagug was first trapped in Galarian. And what she did was she confronted, so hi, Liam. So it's super nice to meet you. This is from a game. This is from Pathfinder, which is not the same as D&D. I probably will do D&D stuff in the future, but I personally really like Pathfinder. I apologize if you were under the impression that this was from the real world. That's not the impression I meant to give you, which is part of the reason why I say Pathfinder Myths and Legends. I hope that clears that up. But yeah, I do have videos where I talk about other myths and legends. Unfortunately, they're older videos of mine. I've talked about myths and legends from Latin America because mythology has always been super interesting to me. So you can definitely check that stuff out if you want to see stuff from Latin America. Pathfinder is tabletop, but there are actual video games. The most famous and the big one that currently exists is Kingmaker, which is for PC and not current generation, PlayStation 4, Xbox One, and a bunch of other game systems. You can get it on Steam. It's a very fun game. I have played it before. I do not currently have it. There is another game that's going to be coming out, I think in 2021, called The Wrath of the Righteous, which is also based on an adventure path. And that one, you get to mess around with demons and stuff. I really like that adventure path. If anyone wants to, I will talk about that adventure path in a separate live stream. I'll give the story breakdown. It is extremely neat. But at the end of time, getting back to the topic at hand so that we can begin to wrap this stuff up. I don't want to keep everyone here forever, at the least. At the end of time, Rovagug gets free and begins to devour all life on Galarian. Rovagug is not going to be able to be stopped forever. There are a few instances of deities being stopped by mortals, but they're extremely rare. One of them is Yggdrasil, which is a god of snakes that was put down by an Atziltani hero. The Atziltani is one of the first human civilizations in Galarian's history. They went to war in the Darklands, which is the name of the area that is underneath Galarian. So Galarian's like hollow earth, so to speak. They went to war with serpent folks who were building an empire over there, who had summoned their god Yggdrasil, and their heroine decapitated that god. Didn't quite kill it, but came like really close. Unfortunately, she was poisoned and she died, but she is one of the few mortals who has stopped an actual deity. There is an adventure path where the player characters also become heroes who stop a deity. Not going to give out spoilers because that's like huge spoilers for whatever campaigns I'm talking about, but there's 2 or 3 where that happens. So when Rovagug gets freed from its prison, it will go on to try and devour the entire planet, starting with the goddess Sarenrae. And Sarenrae will almost certainly fall in battle to it, and odds are the creature will win. It's a god of destruction. It exists to destroy things. Sarenrae is a goddess of goodness and fire, but this is the end of all existence that we're discussing. This is the way that a lot of people think that Ragnarok is like the end of time in Norse cosmology. That's what this is, basically. That's what we're discussing here. So this is not a good end. Good stuff doesn't happen here. Rovagug will probably win, will probably kill Sarenrae, and will go on to begin to devour all of life in Galarian. And from there on, the creature will continue its rampage. It probably won't be able to be stopped again because the creature has been nursing its wounds for a period probably at least 1 million years long. I don't think that there's a single like super unified timeline that states explicitly when Rovagug was put down the first time. I actually might be wrong. There might be a timeline that exists. I can think of like one timeline that if it does go back far enough would explicitly state how long it's been, but it's been a while, okay? Like it's been a really long time. It will try to devour everything that it can get its hands on, and the presumption is that it will succeed. That's the basic idea. The basic idea is that it will succeed in devouring all life in the mortal universe, in the mortal plane. And then from then on, the really bad shit happens. So Zal, one of my buddies who might still be here, but was definitely here earlier, mentioned that there was a character in Kingmaker, one of the video games I mentioned earlier, who worships Grodius. Grodius is probably my personal favorite deity in Pathfinder, but he is not a good deity. He is a neutral evil deity of apocalypses and like the end times. And he is a giant fucking moon. Like, you know the moon in Majora's Mask, how it has a face and is like a very angry person? It's that moon. And that moon lurks in the skies above the boneyard, which is where mortal souls go when they have died and they are ready to receive their punishments or their reward and go to their eternal afterlife. So that moon is constantly looming high in the skies above the boneyard. So if you are ever in the boneyard, you get to see that fucking asshole leering down at you. And at all times, it is inching ever closer. So what Pharasma does to buy the universe, or rather the multiverse, a little bit more time is that she throws the souls of atheists at it. She picks the worst atheists and she grabs them and she yeets their souls at that moon. Grodius does not like the taste of atheistic souls, so whenever he starts to nom on them, he gets the message that it's time to fuck all the way off, and he floats back up into the sky. But at some point, presumably when Rovagug is released and has finished devouring all life in the mortal universe, Grodius will not be so happy. I got thrown off for a second because I could hear Rhino barking in the background. This is real life for me, y'all. When I record videos, you don't hear the dogs barking in the background, but this is my life. I actually like the dogs. The dogs are cute, but when they bark, you can hear them, and it's very distracting. So when Grodius reaches the boneyard, Grodius will herald in the beginning of the end. Grodius, as it stands right now, is a minor god who has relatively few worshippers. There are random nihilistic assholes throughout the mortal planes, and then the outer planes that worship Grodius, especially hags. For some reason, lots of different hags and also ash giants are known to worship Grodius. They're just like, yeah, Grodius, that's a sexy moon, and that's my man. So that's weird. But once Grodius hits the boneyard, I think that I remember having played Pathfinder pretty much the entire time the Pathfinders existed, that it used to be believed by players that Grodius would devour Pharasma. That's not the case anymore. For some reason now it's super explicitly stated that Pharasma will witness the end of all of existence, and she will get to see the new survivor from this reality get picked. So the person who's going to be the Pharasma of the next iteration of reality. So now we know better, but back in the day, a lot of Pathfinder players, especially when Grodius was first introduced, thought that Grodius's last act would be devouring Pharasma. That used to be what we believed at the different tables that I wanted to play with, and that I played with as a youngin', because I've been playing Pathfinder since 2011, which means I've been playing Pathfinder for 9 years. That's a really weird thing to think about. But yeah, once that happens, Grodius will herald the actual end of the current iteration of reality, and no one is super clear on what the end of existence will look like. No one is super clear if there will be a bunch of nuclear explosions or whatever, or if we'll all just sort of blink out of existence. The existence of Azathoth, the creature known as the Daemon Sultan and the Nuclear Idiot, for those of you who are Lovecraftian peeps, suggests that everything will just sort of blink out of existence, but that doesn't appear to be what happened with the old iteration of reality. Everything was reduced to quintessential dust at the end of the old iteration of reality, so that's probably what's going to happen this time. For those of you who have no idea about anything Lovecraftian, Azathoth is the head of the outer gods in Lovecraftian mythos. He is a giant fucking orb that exists at the center of reality, and he is perpetually sleepy, by which I mean he's always fucking sleeping. And if he ever wakes up, all of existence comes to an end. I'm really bastardizing that story, but that's basically like the gist of it. Azathoth, the Daemon Sultan, is, I guess, the sort of like anchor of existence in Lovecraftian mythos, and he just vibes most of the time. Sometimes he like yawns or whatever, and also he can be summoned, at least in like most like Cthulhian games that have like the actual outer gods. He can be summoned and you can do shit with like his avatar, but he is the ultimate OP protagonist, and he has decided to take a really long fucking nap, and if he ever wakes up, we're all boned. That's the short and long of it in Lovecraftian mythos. There's a bunch of like other really neat stuff about him. Like there's some creatures that vibe around him that are always playing the flute and some shit that are trying to help keep him asleep. You know what? Let me actually go and see if the dog is actually outside. Just to end today on like a fun note. Let me get Doggo. Doggo is stuck in a door. Doggo's in his owner's room, and that's the reason he's being so annoying. I thought he was locked out of owner's room, so I thought that was why he was barking, but nope. But yeah, there's lots of ways that people can use Azathoth. It's worth noting, if Lovecraftian like stuff is your shtick and you really want to see Lovecraftian stuff in Pathfinder, I will mention a few things and then I'm going to end the stream, so it'll probably be ending in the next like 5 to 10 minutes. There are a ton of Lovecraftian things in Pathfinder. As I mentioned at the beginning of this video, the faction of creatures known as those who remain are the outer gods from Lovecraftian mythos. So Azathoth, Shub-Niggurath, Abathoth, which is a different creature, not Azathoth, and a whole bunch of other creatures have like exist, and in some cases have stat blocks that you can like use and stuff. There is also an adventure path that exists that you can find super easily, where a specific Lovecraftian baddie is the central antagonist, and it's super great. It is my second favorite adventure path. It's called Strange Aeons, and despite the name, does not feature the Aeons that we were discussing earlier. So creatures like Monad and Monad's homies do not make appearances in that adventure path, but a ton of Lovecraftian creatures do, including Haster, he who must not be named, the asshole with the yellow sign. And I really recommend that adventure path. It's a lot of fun. So yeah, also Earth exists in Pathfinder, and there are actually several different adventure paths where you either go to Earth or you go to a reflection of Earth. So that's super neat too. So let's see. How hard is it to seduce one of the elder gods? Well, I think it depends on the elder god in question. If you are talking about, say, Shub, aka the black goat in the wood with 1,000 young, that one's probably pretty easy to seduce, because that one is just, her whole thing is making babies, which is kind of reductionist, and it's kind of unfortunate because she's actually a really cool elder person. There's also some asshole who really likes eating people that has like a kid in super Lovecraftian mythos canon. I can't remember its name, but one, I'm pretty sure it's a male, and I'm pretty sure it's also like on Earth. It's the one from the Wendigo legend, from like the Wendigo Lovecraftian story, which actually wasn't written by Lovecraft. It was written by one of Lovecraft's homies. And also Wendigos are themselves creatures from a Native American legend about what happens if you eat people. Apparently it corrupts your soul and turns you into an evil fucking monster after you die. So, I mean, Native American, that specific Native American tribe was apparently very against cannibalism. Cthulhu canonically exists in Pathfinder and has a stat block that you can find super easily that is like hyper official, but Cthulhu is stuck on Earth because the city of Realeth, or however you pronounce it, exists on Earth and is stuck under the sea. A lot of the Lovecraftian stuff features Earth, but there's also an adventure path that features Baba Yaga, the witch in the woods. If you are familiar with like Slavic mythology, you might be familiar with Baba Yaga. If you're familiar with John Wick, you're familiar with a really dumb, not at all accurate version of Baba Yaga. Baba Yaga is a character who exists in Galarian who does not have stat blocks, unfortunately, but she is like the sort of super matriarch of a country known as Ireson, the land of eternal winter. And all of her kids get to rule the country for 100 years. And there's an adventure path where you get to go to that land and fuck around. It's very fun. Honestly, a lot of the adventure paths from Pathfinder are like really good. I don't like like the older ones, like the Kingmaker adventure path is not a really fun adventure path, even though the game itself is actually pretty fun. But in fairness, Kingmaker is like literally the very first adventure path. So it makes sense that it was a really rough experience. I do not begrudge Paizo for being like, hey, this isn't our best work. Also, for anyone curious, Kingmaker is getting a rewrite for 2nd edition Pathfinder that includes a bunch of new shit, which is super exciting. So yeah, that's a lot of really fun stuff. I'm trying to think of like other really neat stuff related to the Lovecraftian baddies. There's an entire country where like everything is super spooky themed. It's not Nadal, although that's a country that's super spooky themed, where like there's cults to the Lovecraftian gods. There's also an entirely separate faction, which I'm going to be doing a video on, called the Tapestry of the Black, aka the Black Dominion, which is a bunch of assholes who worship evil aliens and who also like worship in black holes. And they do not like the Lovecraftian deities, and they are actually at war with them, even though their writing is so weird that people like in universe in Galarian think that the Black Dominion worships the Lovecraftian deities. But yeah, Kingmaker's pretty okay. It's yeah, the adventure path is a lot more stilted than the video game is, which is super interesting. So for the whole alien thing, there's just a ton of alien factions because the universe that Pathfinder's set in has different like universes in it. But where humans, elves, dwarves, and orcs and like the stereotypical fantasy races live, there's entire like galaxies that are filled with life. And there is actually a like resource book for players who want to learn more about the solar system that Pathfinder is set in that details all of the planets in Galarian's like solar system. It also details the sun where creatures live because, you know, there's creatures made of fire. So there's creatures that are just like, yeah, I live on the sun. It's very easy for me to live on the sun. I am made of fire. Um, if you really like science fiction, you can also play Star stream. Aha, I'm back. Yay. Okay. Okay. Cool. So I'm gonna go ahead and wrap shit up just so that way this stream has like an actual legit ending. But I hope that everyone has fun. I currently have very little money to buy actual groceries and stuff. So if you have money and you want to send it my way, that's much appreciated. I have like $5 in my bank account. I have enough to pay my bills. It's not enough to do everything else. But yeah, so this was really fun. My internet decided to cut out at the last minute, which is really annoying, but I am going to go ahead and end this. I'll just put like one or two things in the chat. If someone else wants to, it's actually in like the video description. So let me just hop on there for 2 seconds. I'm going to hop back into the chat. If you have extra dinero and you would like to throw some my way, that would be nice. I'll just copy some links and put them in here, and then that'll be it. That is apparently too long. I want to do this before everything like collapses again, which is part of the reason why I'm doing it like really fast. Because I don't know how long it's going to stay stable. But I had a really fun time. We are going to do more of these. I really enjoy this, and I hope that you guys had a fun time as well. Good night.